Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy my videos. I'm currently growing the channel and I'm getting very close to 1,000 subscribers, so it would mean the world to me if you could support me. And today we're going to be talking about Slimefoot and Squee, one of the new commanders from March of the Machine. And if you don't know what Slimefoot and Squee does, for 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green, it's a legendary creature fungus goblin 3/3 with whenever Slimefoot and Squee enters the battlefield or attacks, create a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. And for 1 colorless, 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green, and sacrifice a sapperling, return Slimefoot and Squee and up to 1 other creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcery. So as I mentioned in my preview video, I think this is a really powerful effect. It's basically repeatable reanimation, which is incredibly strong and a really great effect to have. It's actually incredibly easy to go infinite with this and Phyrexian Altar. All you really need is a creature that makes 2 bodies on ETB. There's a bunch of creatures that do that, so you could actually build this as a straight up combo deck. That shouldn't be too difficult to do, but we're not going to go for that here. We're going to go for more of a value based approach. We're still going to try to use the ability to its full effect as much as possible, but we're not trying to go infinite with it. So with that purpose in mind, we have a lot of sacrifice effects. We have a lot of cards that make sapperlings so that we basically never run out and we can keep recurring this from our graveyard and getting it into the graveyard in the first place. So without further ado, let's get started, and we're starting off with Braid's Arisen Nightmare. This is a card that I put in a lot of decks because it's just so good. In this deck, it's going to let us sacrifice a creature at the end of turn and put our opponents in an awkward situation, hopefully. We also have some artifacts we can occasionally sacrifice, like treasure tokens and the like, and sacrificing a land can sometimes be good too if we have more than our opponents. Next up is Cankerbloom, and it's here because it has synergy with our commander in many different ways. First, it can sacrifice itself to get into the graveyard. That's something that we want. It can also destroy artifacts or enchantments. That's always great to have. And then Proliferate can actually be kind of useful in this deck, as you will see later on. We have a lot of cards that are sapperlings that rely on having counters on them. This can proliferate those. So yeah, all around, it's a card that is already quite good in most decks, but in this deck, it fits very, very well. It's also a fungus, and there's even some cards that care about that. Next up, we have Chainer Nightmare Adept. This is a great way to recur some value late game. It also allows us to put creatures that we want into our graveyard for them to be reanimated with Squee. Next up, we have Chaos Defiler. I really like this card. It's a great way to remove permanents from your opponents, although you do get a little bit of randomness involved. In this deck that's going to have it entering and dying so often, it can actually be an absolute pain for your opponents to deal with. Craterhoof Behemoth is the way we're going to try to finish the game in this deck. It is a little bit boring and a little bit expensive, but honestly, there's not really much else that works as well with small armies of sapperlings. Next up, we have Deathrite Shaman, and Deathrite Shaman is good in a wide variety of decks, but again, in this deck, it should be better than in most. You should be playing some lands that fetch other lands. In that case, Deathrite Shaman basically becomes a mana dog, but it's also going to be able to mess with our opponent's graveyards in the mid to late game, so that's a really great option to have. Deathspore Thalid is the first of our spore counter creatures. This one is pretty good because we can remove 3 counters from it to make a sapperling. That does take a while if we don't have that many proliferate effects, but we mostly want it for the second ability, which is going to allow us to sacrifice one of our sapperlings to give -1/-1 to a creature. Getting repeatable removal off of our little tokens is fantastic. Graveyard Carnage Dominus is in the deck because we have quite a few effects that trigger on creatures dying or creatures that straight up have a death trigger, so this is going to work very well with that. And if our graveyard is stocked enough, we can remove some of the less important creatures from there and give it indestructible. Eternal Witness is just a great way to recur some of our cards late game. Junji the Midnight Sky is a card that can work very well with the theme of the deck. Mostly it's used for the reanimation cause, but in this deck we have so much reanimation anyway that it might be better to just make our opponents discard 2 cards each time until they have no hand left to work with. Catholic Crucible Goliath is a new card, and it's very good in this deck, so we can just sacrifice one of our big cards, maybe one that has a death trigger such as Junji, and then we're going to basically cascade until we cascade into something that costs less and is non-legendary, so we're always going to get value, and it's another way to be able to sacrifice our creatures. Corozda Guildmage fits this deck perfectly. It's going to allow us to sacrifice a creature and get a number of sapperlings equal to its toughness. That's obviously great because we want to be sacrificing and we want to have sapperlings. Mahadi is going to ramp us quite a bit. If we have a turn where we sacrificed a bunch of sapperlings or creatures, we can suddenly find ourselves with a ton of treasure tokens. Michaeloth works really well in a deck where we want to be sacrificing stuff and where we have so many replaceable creatures. Usually this card is very risky because you might sacrifice your whole board to it, but in this deck we don't care that much if it's removed because we're going to be able to reanimate it anyway, and the fact that it has counters is even relevant because we can proliferate those with a couple of our effects. Nimata Grove Guardian is a pretty old card. We can just pay to make a sapling straight up. That should mean that we never run out of them, and it's also kind of like a mini overrun effect for saplings, although we do have to sacrifice saplings to do so, which is kind of weird. The newer version of Nimata is also in the deck. It's already a good card, I think, in most decks, but in this deck it works really well. Seeing as it exiles our opponent's creatures and gives us saplings, that's really fantastic. And then we can actually just use those saplings to pump it, which sometimes might be relevant, or draw cards off of sacrificing the saplings, which is obviously awesome. Psychotrope Thalid has the same kind of ability of making saplings as some of the other cards in this deck, and similar to Nimata, we can pay 1 and sacrifice a sapling to draw a card, so these are all great to have. Ravenous Chupacabra is one of the best removals stapled onto a creature. It's great to recover from our graveyard with Slimefoot and Squee. Ruthless Technomancer is another way we can get a creature into our graveyard, and then we can sacrifice a bunch of treasures to just reanimate as well, so this can kind of do an impression of our commander when our commander is not in play. Sakura Tribe Elder gets itself into the graveyard whilst ramping us. We couldn't ask for much more in this deck. Shriekmaw similarly puts itself into the graveyard whilst removing an opposing creature. Very good. Slimefoot the Stowaway is the original Slimefoot, and it's actually gonna do quite a lot of damage in this deck because we have so many saplings dying that it should be able to drain our opponents for quite a bit, and we can also just pump any unspent mana we have into its ability. Solemn is obviously great because it has both an ETB and a death trigger. Spore Sower Thalid is one of the better Thalids in the deck because it's actually going to put spore counters on each fungus you control, including something like Cankerbloom, for example. And then as usual, we remove 3 counters from Spore Sower Thalid and we're going to get a sapling. Sprouting Thrynax is great to sacrifice because it has a death trigger and it's going to give us 3 saplings when it dies, so that's just perfect. Sir Conrad the Grim is going to work really well in a deck that's going to make so many little creatures and have so many creatures hit the graveyard. This is another of our finishers and it's going to do the job very well in this deck. It's also incredibly difficult to deal with because we can just reanimate it with Slimefoot and Squee. Tendershoot Dryad is good in most decks, but in a deck that cares about saplings, this becomes one of the better cards in the entire deck. Ulash the Hateseed is similarly a decent card normally, but in this deck it just excels because we can make saplings for really cheap with this, and it's also going to come in with a ton of counters because we should have quite a few saplings lying around. And since we also have Proliferate in the deck, we can even get more counters onto this. Underseller Myconid enters the battlefield and immediately gives us a sapling, which is great, and then it just acts as mana ramp. Absolutely fine card. Utopia Mycon is a spore counter card that has a ramp effect added in. We can sacrifice the sapling to add 1 mana of any color. That's going to help us combo off and have some really big turns. Verdant Force is fantastic because again we're getting a sapling at every upkeep. Yeheni is just a way to sacrifice stuff at instant speed that survives board wipes, and the fact that it can grow is always welcome. And finally, Ziatora the Incinerator is another way to sacrifice our creatures for profit. In this case we're going to be dealing a bunch of damage and getting some treasures. Moving on, we have sorceries. Agadeem's Awakening is going to be a great way to rebuy some value and have a really big turn late game. Alligator Recovery is just going to help us get back something that we've used earlier on. Breach the Multiverse is a great card that gives us a huge boost in creatures and fills up graveyards, which works really well with our deck. Faithless Looting is great because we want to be filling up the graveyard with creatures, so we love it in this deck. Incarnation Technique is always good in any deck that's looking to reanimate or use the graveyard, and this is no exception. And then moving on, we have our instants. We have Artifact Mutation, which is good removal that in this deck synergizes super well. Fungal Rebirth should be a fantastic regrowth effect since getting 2 saplings attached is a dream come true. Heroic Intervention is going to help to protect our board, and Malakir Rebirth is here not so much for protection but just for value in this deck. Pylon is going to work really well since surveilling is something that we're really interested in and we have so many small tokens. Plum the Forbidden is great in any deck that's looking to sacrifice small creatures, and we have a ton of those in this deck. And Tear Asunder is going to deal with an opponent's permanent and it's basically close to unconditional removal. For artifacts, we have Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar. These are both going to work really well by sacrificing all of our little saplings to give us mana. They can also sacrifice any big creature we have in play so that we can reuse this enters the battlefield with our commander. Conduit of Worlds is a great late game card, and since we're probably going to be dumping quite a few cards into our graveyard, it's nice to be able to play lands from there. Skull Clamp is going to work really well with all the sapling tokens we're making, and Staff of Completion is a card that I keep putting in every deck because I can't find a reason not to. In this deck it's also better than normal because the first effect is actually a great sack outlet if we need it to be. For enchantments, we have Goblin Bombardment, which is one of the best sack outlets in Commander. Golgari Germination is going to work so well in a deck that is looking to sacrifice creatures and make saplings. Greater Good works well with our big creatures so that we can draw cards and dump stuff into our graveyard. Industrial Advancement is one of my favorite favorite cards in the game at the moment, and I love it in this deck. Being able to sacrifice stuff that we want to die anyway and getting value off of it feels great. And finally, Riveteer's Ascendancy is also going to work really well because we're sacrificing so much that this should almost always get us value. Next up, we have battles. We have Invasion of Ikoria, which is a nice little tutor that can find us our win con or a value piece. And then the other side is really good in this deck because we're actually not really running many humans at all. For planeswalkers, we have Vivian on the Hunt. I really like this one in a lot of decks, and here it kind of has a toolbox effect where we get to sacrifice stuff and bring in something that costs more. That's really great, but when you add to it the +1, which is going to give us card advantage and fill up our graveyard, then it's just perfect in this deck. Finally, for lands, we're going to have High Market, which is something that you should definitely have in most sacrifice-based decks, and Bojuka Bog to deal with your opponent's graveyards. So there you have it. This has been our Slimefoot and Squee deck, and I really like this one. I might end up putting it together if I ever stop playing my Henzi Toolbox Torre deck. There's just so many sweet commanders in this set that I'm gonna have to really pace myself. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!